So chapter 5, section 7, we're going to be using congruent triangles now. So what we're going to do in this section is you're going to already have proven the two triangles are congruent by one of the 5 shortcuts. Then from there, we're going to be able to go back and find other congruent pieces of the triangle. So there's going to be how we can prove two segments or two angles congruent. First, we have to prove that the two triangles are congruent. And then we can state that any of the leftover parts that didn't have markings are going to be congruent by using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. This is the acronym for it. Every other letter, if you notice in the acronym, is a C. So what each one stands for is C. This first C is for the word corresponding. Then the P is for parts. Then this C is for congruent. This T is for triangles. And then lastly, the last C is for congruent. So corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. This will always usually be your last reason in your proof. You're going to first have to prove the triangles are congruent by one of the 5 shortcuts. And then after that, you're going to go back and find another congruent part of the triangle using this reason. So for example, if I draw 2 triangles here, I'm going to call one of them ABC. And then the other one will be DEF. I'm going to add some congruency marks. I'm going to say that C is congruent to F and A is congruent to D. And I'm going to give you the side marked as congruent as well. So already I can see that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF because of the angle, side, angle shortcut. So you're going to have to go through some process of proving the triangles are congruent. You might be given everything, but then what it's going to ask you to prove is it may ask you, now show me that angle B is congruent to angle E. And after this statement of proving the triangles congruent, your next statement in your proof will be that angle B is congruent to angle E, and that reason is Cpctc. Because if you remember back to the very first lesson of the chapter, or the second one, the only way that we could have proved triangles congruent before we learned the shortcuts is to show that every single piece had a corresponding part. Now that we've already done 3 pieces and shown that they're congruent, now we can go back and say that every piece can get markings. So for example, I can now add in that B is congruent to E because I already know the triangles are congruent. So now I can go back and put markings on everything. Another thing they might have asked, instead of show that B is congruent to E, they might have said show that side AB is congruent to DE. Well, if I've already established that these are 2 congruent triangles, I can go back now and say that AB is congruent to DE. And my reason, again, is the Cpctc. So after you show that the 2 triangles are congruent, you can go back and put markings on every single piece that doesn't have a mark. And the reason that you're allowed to do that is because of Cpctc. Because corresponding parts of already proven triangles that are congruent can also be labeled as congruent. And then here would be EF. So you're going to probably be asked to say, give me that one of these pieces, these last pieces that didn't have a mark, are also congruent. after you prove the triangles are congruent. So we have our proof here. So let's go ahead and set up our statement and reason columns. Number one, I'm going to state all my given, that PR bisects angle QPS, and that PQ is congruent to PS. Let me label my picture. So PQ congruent to PS, and then I've got this angle here, QPS, right here, that has been bisected. So that tells me that it's going to split it into two congruent pieces. So this angle is congruent to this. So this was given. Now I have to state in my proof the definition of an angle bisector and what it does. So I can state that angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR, and that reason is definition of an angle bisector. Now, my goal here, in order to get to this, I need to be able to identify that the triangles are congruent, and then my last statement will be Q is congruent to S by the Cpctc. So I need to figure out right now in my two triangles here, I got this blue one, and then I got the pink one. I need to show that these two triangles are congruent. I have two pieces of congruent information on them. I'm going to get my third one, the obvious one, which is this reflexive side here. I can state that PR is congruent to PR. And the reason is reflexive. And then now I can state that the two triangles are congruent by side angle side. And again, the order matters here. So I'm going to state that triangle QPR is congruent to triangle SPR. And that reason is side angle side. So now that I've established that the two triangles are congruent, I can now state that angle Q is congruent to angle S, and my reason for saying that is because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are also congruent. So I can now go back and say that because I've already shown that the pink one was congruent to the blue one, now I can go back and say this angle is congruent to this one. I could have also changed the proof here, and instead of saying this statement, I could have asked you to prove that angle PRQ is congruent to angle PRS. I could have said prove this instead. So then I would just have written this here with the Cpctc. Or another thing I could have asked you to prove is that QR is congruent to SR. Once you prove that the two triangles are congruent, I can now go back and add congruency marks to all the pieces that don't have a mark. And then I can add here 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Because I know that as soon as I show three things and use a shortcut, technically every single piece is also congruent, which was the first way we learned before we learned the shortcuts. So always, 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 whenever this is in a proof, you had to have shown that the triangles were congruent before you can use that. If you have not shown your triangles are congruent, you can't use Cpctc. Another proof, so set up your statements. and your reasons. Again, I'm going to state all my given. PR bisects, it's bisecting two angles this time, QPS and QRS. And then I'm asking you to prove segments again. So in order to use Cpctc, I need to figure out if these two triangles are congruent. So let me go ahead and figure out where the angles are that are being bisected. So I have QPS over here. So that tells me it's going to split this angle into two congruent pieces. And then I have this angle on the other side that is also been bisected. So then that tells me that this splits this one into two equal pieces. Now I have to state that in my proof. I can put it in as just one statement. So I'm going to state both angles being bisected. So I'm going to state that angle QPR, I'm doing the red one first, is congruent to angle SPR. And then the pink one with the double marks, angle QRP, is congruent to angle SRP. And these are both definition of an angle bisector. So now both of my triangles here, again, the blue, let's do green. So that one and that one. Now the green and the gray triangle have two pieces of congruency. I need a third. And I got my obvious one right here in the middle, that this segment PR, it's in both. So I can say that PR is congruent to PR. And this is reflexive. Now, if you switched up statements 2 and 3, you could have said the reflexive before the angle bisector. It doesn't matter. Now I have enough information to prove my two triangles are congruent. So I can state that QRP is congruent to SRP. And that reason is angle side angle. Now I can go back and any other angle or side that doesn't have markings, I can go back and say they're congruent. But all they asked me to show was that RQ was congruent to RS. And that reason is Cpctc. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now I can add in that RQ is congruent to RS. Remember that we can also have added in that angle Q is also congruent to angle S because of Cpctc. Or I could have also added in markings to PQ and PS. So remember, once you show the triangles are congruent by a shortcut, you can go back and label all 3 angles and all 3 sides. Good? And that reason, once you've proven them congruent, is that all the rest of the corresponding parts are also congruent. One more proof. Next. Set it up, statements and reasons. Now in tonight's homework, they're just going to ask you to make a plan for a proof. But if you want to practice writing the 2-column, you could take the information that they're giving you and maybe in Notability write it as a 2-column proof. But you're just, again, dragging and dropping the reasons here. So no real work, just screenshot your score, turn that into Canvas. So WX congruent to YZ and ZW congruent to XY, and that's given. And I'm going to label my picture. So I have WX congruent to YZ and WZW congruent to XY. So Right now, I'm trying to prove that this triangle here, oops, let me do a highlight, that this triangle here is congruent to this. So then I can go back and show angles 1 and 2 are congruent. Now, if they would have told me that I had parallel lines, then I could have used like an alternate interior. But I'm not told that anything's parallel here. So what I need to do is establish that these two triangles are congruent. So again, I got my obvious side in the middle, that XZ or ZX, however you want to say it, it doesn't matter, is congruent to itself. So that's my next statement. ZX congruent to ZX. If you called it XZ, that's fine as well. This is reflexive. And now notice you have all three sides marked with congruencies. So I can say that these two triangles are congruent. XWZ is congruent to triangle ZYX, and that reason is side, side, side. And now I can go back and say that the three angles are also congruent, but they only wanted me to do one. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and that reason is Cpctc. So we can go back and state that this angle is congruent here. I could also say that 3 is congruent to 4 by this same reason, Cpctc. Or I could also go back and say that angle W is congruent to angle Y. Again, by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So remember, whenever you want to use this as a reason and a proof, you need to have first proven the triangle's congruent. Any questions? We can't say that 1 and 2 are alternate interior because what I could do is, now that I've shown that 1 and 2 are congruent, let's say that they said prove that YZ is parallel to WX. Then you could say by the alternate interior angles converse, the lines are parallel. But we can't use the alternate interior angles theorem to show that 1 and 2 are congruent. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So that's how, if they ask you to do one more step, you would have had to put that, but then this would have been another step, and the reason would have been by the alternate interior angles converse. So if they modified it, yes.